Okay, welcome to Unit 7. We are moving into the progressive era, and I really want you to focus on that first word, progressive, to make progress. Throughout this unit, I want you to keep in mind the question of how does reform, government reform, societal reform, economic reform, how does that cause progress? How does that propel the nation forward? Keep that in mind as we go through the different topics that we'll cover throughout this unit. Your weekly outline. Notice that you only have 2 assignments for this week. You have to watch this video, which you will reflect on in your Journal 15, as well as the Unit 7 readings. Those can be found within the assignment post in Teams. I've included the outline for the unit in the assignment as well to help some of you organize your notes. You do not have to use it as it says in the assignment outline, but it's there to help you and guide you. Your other assignment for the week is the Unit 7 documents. As it says in the assignment description, you can submit a separate document with your answers on it if you find that the space given in the document is not enough. Now on Friday, you do have a work day. I have posted the Unit 7 short paper assignment. That's not due until January 22nd, so it's about 3 weeks that you have to work on it, but you will be given time throughout the next couple weeks to work on it so that you don't have to do it at the last minute. Just know that you've got some extra time this week if you want to start looking at your question, researching, and outlining the argument that you want to present. Okay, let's start with the origins of progressivism. So, the time period that we are talking about right now goes hand in hand with the unit that we just went through. Many of the reforms that we discuss are going to be caused by the rapid industrialization that was happening during the Gilded Age, how quickly we built up the cities, how quickly our economy propelled forward, and we saw that standard of living rising. We saw that mass movement, urbanization to the cities from rural to urban, the huge influx of immigration happening all at once, the economic growth that went very unregulated at the time and was unprecedented in the United States, which caused the gap between the rich and the poor. All of these pieces that came together during the Gilded Age are going to call for political action. They are going to call for progress to be made through reform. So, this entire unit comes from all of the issues that we saw, the storm brewing that we saw in the Gilded Age, caused by those monopolies, caused by those unchecked big business industrialists. It's going to call for the action of the government where it had not been before, because remember, it was all laissez-faire, hands off. This is all going to call, the people are going to call for political action. And that's why we call this era the era of progressivism, the progressive era, to make progress, to make our society as good on the inside as it looked on the outside. Now, I know I say that, and then we shift to the first section here that's on the agrarian movement. So I was just talking about industry, urbanization, and things like that. But we can't forget the piece, the big chunk, the original backbone of the United States, which was the agrarian movement. And we have to look at the issues that were occurring in that piece as well, because that's really where the root of this call for action came from. Not that they shared the same ideas, but that they are going to call for the same kind of action in society. So let's start. What was the problems that were happening? The farmers' dilemma. First, we had a mass migration to the west. Recall the causes of westward expansion were the transcontinental railroad, that making it easier to move to the west. The Homestead Act in 1862, where Lincoln promised the people if you moved out there and you stayed for 5 years, you could have 160 acres for free. And the gold rush all pushed people to migrate west. And as we referenced in the last unit, the West is not the same as the South or the Northeast or those middle states that we talked about. It is very different land, and it becomes a single crop market. Okay, so there's not a lot of variety coming out of the West. So, what we're going to see is a mass production of a single product. Now, what happens when you mass produce something? Well, there's a lot of it. And like we said last time, and we're going to talk more about in a second, the more demand decreases, when supply increases, you also see a drop in price. Now, this all comes together to attribute to the debt that many of these farmers were falling into, because the prices of crops are falling. But the price of running a farm does not change. You still have to pay for the technology you need. You have to pay for the seed. You have to pay for labor if you so use labor. You're going to have to pay to move your product. So there is this mounting debt that is coming to the farmers. And that goes hand in hand with the increase of prices for production and transportation. This is going to take us back to the railroads, okay? And we're going to talk more about this in just a second, but the cost of production and transportation is going to weigh heavy on the farmers in the West. The farmer's paradox is something we also need to mention. Here is a good time to mention it. This refers to how farmers hurt their own economic condition when they worked hard and overproduced. When farmers work hard and they overproduce, this reduces the prices of their crops and leads to overproduction. So the farmer's paradox is something to note that was occurring in the West, and that is, the harder they worked and the more they produced, the more they hurt the price of their crop. The more they hurt the price of the crop, the less they made. And it's just this cycle of dilemma. The last piece that really created a hardship for the farmers, especially in the West, is going to be the lack of political influence. Now, this is going to come a few puzzle pieces coming together. So bear with me. In the West, remember, we have many territories. There's not that it takes time to qualify for statehood. So as we're waiting for statehood, that means that we're waiting for representation on the national stage, that we're waiting for the government within the state to come to full fruition. With that, we're not seeing the same amount of representation as, say, in some of the other already states in the United States. So when we see all of these problems out in the West, they're lacking political representation, which doesn't allow them to have that political influence. This is also a party that doesn't play the political game, so you're not seeing representatives fighting for the what's best for the farmers, because they're not greasing the pockets of the political representation as much as, say, your big business owners might do, like we talked about in the last unit. So lots of pieces coming together to create a huge dilemma for the farmers at this time. Now, to expand a little bit more on that farmer's paradox, let's talk a little bit about supply and demand. Remember, we talked in the beginning of the last unit how supply, demand, and price all work together. The higher demand you have for something, the lower supply, the higher the price. And the same thing goes in the opposite direction. The higher supply, the lower demand, the lower the price. what your goal is if you're going into business is to create what we see on the graph right there. You want to create an equilibrium where your price and your quantity meet at the intersection of supply and demand. You don't want to have too much or too little supply. You don't want to have too much or too little demand, and you want to hit the sweet spot of that price. And the farmers were really struggling. Their issue was that they had a high supply, a low demand, and a low price, which was not giving them enough to move forward. And at the same time, you have a rise in the cost of business for farmers, and they just aren't able to meet those rising costs. And the rising cost comes from a few different pieces, but think about this: the technology was being created and propelling forward during this time period. That technology on the farm costs more money. If you're not making as much money and your day-to-day activity is costing you more, that means you're falling further and further into debt, creating this cycle of debt that can really hurt business there. And I put on here the tenant farmer because I want you to think back to the ways in which during Reconstruction we answered the question of the high demand for labor once slavery was ended. The same process happened to the tenant farmer, keeping in that cycle of debt, not being able to really go out on their own, and get out of that paradox that they've created. So one of the same kind of cycles here that we see happening. As I mentioned, there is going to be a relationship between big business and farmers. And the first one we need to look at is the railroads. Farmers are going to begin to blame the railroads and the banks for their difficulties. First, the railroads, the monopoly that was created within the railroads, are going to be allowed to set whatever rates they wanted because there was a single control within the market. There was one person running the show in the railroads. So you couldn't, as a farmer, shop around for the best price to move your product. And the farmers had to move their product. They couldn't carry it on their backs. They had to use the railroads and that new technology to be successful. So when the railroad monopoly takes charge and begins to set high rates, the farmers aren't going to be able to meet those high rates, but are going to be forced to take on that debt if they even want to come close to being successful. What they'll resort to is the banks to take out loans to pay to keep in business. And the banks are going to be a monopoly of their own. They're going to set high interest rates on loans because they know the farmers are desperate. They need those loans if they want to survive, and they'll take the high interest rates. Now, moving forward into the future, you need to know that high interest rates are not good. Today, we have the luxury of shopping around, but pay attention to the interest rates. Interest that you accrue over time, or that gets added on to your base rate of the loan over time, could cause you to pay a loan 10 times over before you actually pay it off. And that's exactly what was happening to the farmers. Now, political leaders at the time are no longer farmers, but instead they're coming from industrial states and they're supporting industry. So the farmers are going to kind of be left high and dry when it comes to trying to combat against the monopolies that they're faced against. Farmers are going to feel like they do the honest work producing the necessary goods that the country really needs to survive, while bankers and businessmen get rich and they're kind of working in the shadows. Because of all of this building and building, the farmers are going to be forced to take action. Something else that's kind of adding to the weight that the farmers are carrying around is the agriculture problems that just naturally happen, not caused by monopolies or political leadership, lack thereof of political leadership, but just problems that happen because they happen, such as natural disasters like droughts. The 1890s are going to bring natural disasters to the farmers in the Midwest. There's going to be blistering summers, cruel winters that are very common, but not necessarily planned for and expected to these new settlers in the West. Frequent drought spells made farming extremely difficult, and on top of all of that, you're going to have insect blight that rage through some of the regions, eating further into the profits for the farmers. So, as if it weren't bad enough, the situation that was created within the nation for farmers, they're going to have to face nature and the issues caused by that as well. So, what comes out of this? The Grange movement is going to come out of this. It's going to be organized by Oliver H. Kelly, who was a Minnesota farmer, businessman, journalist, government clerk, kind of a jack of all trades. The goals of this movement were twofold. First, to provide education on new farming techniques to the farmers that are settling in this unknown territory of the West. The second piece was to fight for regulation of the railroads and what we call grain elevators. The grain elevators were storage facilities that had rolled into a monopoly as well, that was charging high rates that the farmers could not afford and were getting buried deeper and deeper into debt in order to use. The organization was built up on funds which are going to enable the Grangers to build some of their own grain elevators that helps combat that half of regulation, but they can't overcome, they're struggling to overcome the railroad monopoly because they can't just build their own railroads as they had built their own grain elevator. When they build their own grain elevator, though, this was a way for the farmers to challenge monopolies by avoiding using their own services. So the farmers proved through the Grange movement that they can combat monopolies, but they still are going to need government assistance to succeed against the railroads. Some of the achievements that we see come out of the Grange movement are going to be the Granger laws. The Granger laws are going to set a maximum railroad rate, and it also established state railroad commissions that would look at legislation covering warehouses and grain elevators. This is a huge win for the farmers because that was a problem that they could not fight without legislation from the government to get those railroads in check, to make it so that they could survive. The Grangers are also going to push for federal government intervention in the form of the Interstate Commerce Commission, or the ICC. This commission was meant to oversee interstate transportation, which again would be the railroads, to make sure that that monopoly would not hurt the average businessman, the average farmer in the future. And they do succeed because the commission is put together in 1887. The Grange movement is going to decline in the 1870s, but farm protests are going to remain strong. And an example that comes after the Grange movement is going to be the Southern Farmers Alliance, which will form to continue to fight for farmers' rights. So, why do we start here? Why does this even matter? It matters because we see a group of people that the nation was built upon, which is farmers, fighting to use their power, their collective power, to cause change from the government. Yes, it's great that we have the nation booming, that we are expanding, that we see industry growing, the economy's doing great, but this movement of the farmers is calling attention to the fact that the people are strong, and if they use their voice, someone will pay attention and change can happen. And that's really what the progressive movement is all about. It's drawing the attention of the government to problems facing the people in the United States, to cause change, to cause reform. All right, let's take a peek. Now we're going to look into populism. This is going to bring up the idea of third parties within the government. And I will tie this all back in together, I promise. But populism, the next piece. And this is the final section that we'll do in this lecture. The Populist Party is also known as the People's Party, the party of the average person. Okay, and the average person was farmers. So again, this political party is going to be farmers coming together against big business. The goals of this movement are going to be to fight corruption within the government, within the monopolies, and it's going to be to preserve agriculture as well. So preserve the backbone. The party is brought together, that brings together the farmers that want to fight against big business. They're going to run on a campaign against corrupt government officials and corrupt economic power. The members of this party are going to claim that they've been overlooked as big business and railroads have been helped and prospered. So again, they're going to draw attention to the issues that are facing the average person at the time. So let's talk money backing, because this is going to be incredibly important as we move forward. The money at the time was backed by gold. Okay, now there are many problems that come with backing the money supply in gold, because there's only so much gold in the world. So that means there can only be so much money that is accepted, that has value within the world. Well, that creates a problem. Farmers are going to want inflation. The reason being is that they believed it would be easier to pay off their debt because they would have more money for selling less. But in order to create inflation, more money needed to be made, and that money needed to not be backed by gold. So there is going to be a political party that forms that is called the Greenback Party. Greenbacks are dollars that are not backed by gold and can just be printed, which would lead to inflation. The Greenback Party and the Greenback Labor Party are each going to run candidates for president in the elections of 1876, 1880, and 1884 under the platform that we should just print money that is not backed by gold. No candidate in any of these elections is going to be able to muster enough national support to get the idea to actually happen, and soon farmers are going to have to choose another strategy. Inflation could also be created by printing money that was backed by silver as well as gold. Now, this idea was more popular than the greenbacks because people felt more confident if their money was backed by something of value. So, America had also had this tradition before of coining silver money, but it only lasted until 1873. So the farmers see this as a way to succeed in causing more money to be printed. So they kind of switch from the idea of greenbacks to the idea of backing money with silver rather than gold. In 1892, the populists are going to run a candidate named James Weaver for president on this exact platform of replacing the backing of money with silver. He's going to poll over 1 million popular votes and 22 electoral college votes. Although he's going to fall short of the victory, populist ideas are now going to be discussed on the national level. And when the Panic of 1893 hits the following year, an increased number of unemployed Americans is going to give momentum again, breathe life again into the populist movement. And that will lead to the great showdown in the election of 1896. So it's kind of a progression here that the farmers start with this idea of greenbacking and realize that that's not going to be a successful idea. So the Greenback Party falls apart and is was replaced by the populist party, still being made up of farmers, but now pushing the idea of replacing the money backing with silver instead of gold. So let's talk. What are the populist party platforms? First of all, I love this picture because a platform like you see there that's being built is what a party stands for. And here you can see in the political cartoon that they stand for the Constitution, the people, jobs, a living wage. That is the foundation of the Populist Party. But to get specific, some of the ideas of the Populist Party are going to include a graduated income tax. Now, there used to be a flat tax, okay? So what that meant is everybody, no matter what money you made, anybody paid the same amount of income tax. Now that is absolutely ridiculous that a worker in one of the oil refineries was paying the same amount of taxes as the billionaire Rockefeller. That's crazy talk. But the Populist Party is going to propose that we change that idea and that we instead go to a graduated income tax, which all you have to remember is the more you make, the more you pay. Also, the Populist Party is going to push for the direct election of senators. Before, senators were not directly elected by the people. In the Constitution, there's more of a complicated process that senators would be chosen from a vote within other elected officials, but that needs to change, is what the Populist Party says. Senators are supposed to represent the people and should be chosen directly by the people. This would require an amendment to the Constitution. So this was a very ambitious proposal by the Populist Party, but it made sense. Give the people a voice in the government by allowing for the direct election of senators. They're also going to push for the secret ballot. Now, again, that's something that we have today, and it kind of makes sense. It's kind of common sense, but they're going to say, why don't we have it? People are voting due to political machines and voter intimidation. We should allow people to vote in private so we get their true vote. Secret ballot. They're also going to propose term limits, which at this time there were none. There wasn't even a term limit on the presidency. And they're going to say it is high time that we impose term limits on elected officials to kind of light a fire under them. If they know that they only have a certain amount of time in office, maybe they'll get stuff done. And here's the golden goose. They want the coinage of silver. So they want to be able to coin more money to cause inflation, which the farmers want. But they want to coin it out of silver, which would help everybody. People trust money that has a solid backing like silver, and we can have inflation happening all at the same time. The Populist Party is also going to push for the idea of government ownership of the railroads. They are going to say this monopoly is too much. It needs to stop. We need to instead have the government owning the railroads and controlling the railroads to avoid the high prices set by monopolies. They're also going to be a huge proponent of direct democracy, which is a little bit different than the democratic republic that we live in. They're going to say the people should directly represent themselves, which is a little bit crazy. So I'm not saying that their ideas were all great, but the ideas that actually are in place today that came from this platform are the graduated income tax, the direct election of senators, the secret ballot, the term limit. All of those are things that we actually have. So, how crazy could they have been? The ultimate showdown of the Populist Party on the national stage is the election of 1896. Like I had mentioned, In 1893, the panic happens. We see high unemployment, low consumption because people don't have jobs, they don't have money, they're not spending. When we see this economic depression happening, the ideas of the Populist Party don't seem so crazy, and they're able to get more people on their side, which lays the foundation of running William Jennings Bryan as a Democratic candidate, but also as the face of the Populist Party. Now, William Jennings Bryan is going to give a speech called the Cross of Gold speech, where he says, and we'll look at a political cartoon in a second, that the money backing in gold is a cross that the people bear that they cannot bear any longer. And he really pushes forward with this notion that we need to get rid of the gold backing. We need to move forward into the new age. He also refers to himself as the great commoner, which allows people to relate to him instead of being this wealthy, faraway, almost kingly person. He says, I am just like you. We are one and the same. His opponent in this election is William McKinley, who was all about industry, all about supporting industry. And what we really see here, when William McKinley supports industry, he gets the people on his side that were afraid of inflation. Laborers are going to fear the idea of inflation because it could hurt a wage earning, rent paying factory worker. Just because there's more money does not mean that the prices of what they have to pay for goes down. Inflation to a wage earner is terrible. Their wage could stay the same. The price of their rent, the price of the products that they purchase would all rise with inflation. But wage earners don't make more money just because inflation happens, which means they would have to pay more and be earning the same amount of money. That's bad. That's very bad. So this fight over the backing of the money supply really pits city versus country. The economy begins to hit an upswing in 1896. Had the election happened in the heart of the panic, in the heart of the Depression, we may have seen a different outcome, because really this election of 1896 is the end of the Populist Party when they lose to William McKinley 271 to 176 in the Electoral College. But I find this very interesting. When you look at the map, notice where all of those blue states are. Notice where all of the red states are. If you looked at a map of 2020, those colors would flip, but the designation between the two voters, the two voting parties, would be very, very similar. So it's interesting. I love looking at political party maps. The gray areas are territories that had not been admitted to the United States yet. The importance of this election, though, even though the Populists lost, and we just spent 15 minutes talking about how cool the Populist Party was, even though they lost, what the Populist Party does is bring this legacy to a third party. And we'll talk more about the legacy in just a second, but the Populist Party was really the first third party that had entered the national stage with any sort of clout behind it. Now, I want to look at this political cartoon just so that we can see, and I always think it's ridiculous how dramatic this is, but I didn't live at the time, so I don't know, maybe it was this dramatic. But this is a political cartoon that is meant to represent the Cross of Gold speech that was given by the populist Democratic Party candidate in the election of 1896, William Jennings Bryan. So you see here that we have the crown of thorns being held that was used by Bryan, the cross of gold that was used by Bryan in his Chicago speech, and the papers that he has in his bag say from the Bible, and one says speech plagiarized from the Bible. He's standing on a ripped version of the Bible. The flag behind him says anarchist. So you can see here that there's kind of a twofold. You have Brian, who is really pulling at these images from the Bible, playing on the religious underlyings in the nation at the time, and getting people to understand when he says, "We bear this cross of gold." They really understand, like, oh boy, this is serious, this is bad. We have this crown of thorns that is the gold backing. And when he gives these images to the people, people really start to understand the weight of what he is saying. But others kind of say that, he's taking from the Bible, and it's not necessarily applicable. If he were to achieve getting the money not backed by gold anymore, that could lead to anarchy. So you can see kind of the duplicitous nature of this argument in this political cartoon here. Now, the last thing I want us to look at is the legacy of the Populist Party. Okay? Money now has changed. So I do want to get to that. But let me first. Okay, so we have the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party really starts to become the People's Party after this. So we're really starting to see the shift in political parties now. I can't tell you how many times you guys have asked me, when do the political parties start to become what they are today? Well, you're looking at it right now. Okay, when the Populist Party candidate of William Jennings Bryan runs also as a Democratic candidate, we are now seeing a complete shift of the Democratic Party, where up until this point we had been talking about the Democratic Party is for states' rights, it's for a weak federal government. We are starting to see the exact opposite. Remember the platform of the Populist Party: direct democracy, voice of the people, yes, but we are also starting to see a call for government action, government ownership of the railroad. That's huge. Having the government help the people is what the Democratic Party starts to shift into at this time. Another legacy of the Populist Party is the graduated income tax. Today, that's how our tax system is set up. It is based on how much you make. That way, someone like me isn't paying the same amount as Elon Musk. Okay? We make different amounts of money. Now, could we get into a huge argument about how the top doesn't pay as much as they should in taxes? Yes, but that is for another day. The graduated income tax is essentially set up so the more you make, the more you do pay. We do see a heavy regulation of the railroads start to come in by the government because of the calls of the Populist Party. Now, I was getting ahead of myself when we first flipped onto this slide, but here we are. The Populist Party brings a flexibility to the money system. The money system right now is not backed by gold, okay? The money system now is backed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. It is no longer gold or silver, and we call this the fiat money supply. Or the fiat money, sorry. This is government issued currency that is not backed by a physical commodity such as gold or silver. The value of fiat money is derived from the relationship between supply and demand and the stability of the issuing government rather than the worth of a commodity backing it. So, our money supply right now is based on how the economy does as a whole and how the government does as a whole. So, that's why you see when something crazy happens in the government, you see the economy kind of go hand in hand with that. Most modern paper currencies are just like this. They're not backed by gold or silver. And that word fiat, which I'm sure I'm saying wrong, it's spelled Fiat, comes from a Latin derivative and is often translated as "it shall be" or "let it be done." So it's kind of just saying, this is what it is, trust us. So we do have a lot more trust in the money supply, but that's why it's also a little bit more flexible today, because it all kind of falls on how much does the government print, how stable is the government, and what is the supply and demand out in the market. The Populist Party legacy also gives legacy to the third party. Like I said, this is really the first time, and it's not that we haven't had third parties before. There have been, but you should note that we haven't talked about any up until this point, which means there haven't been any of note. The Populist Party, though, says it is possible for a third party to rise to the national stage if it has the right party platform. So the Populist Party says, maybe we don't just have to have two political parties. I mean, I get it. We've been stuck in the system still today, of only having two political parties that actually make it to the national stage. But there are third parties that exist, and maybe someday we'll make the change to get rid of the two party system. But it begins with a successful third party, which was the Populists. The Populist Party also shifts to this idea that you need to campaign to the people, because it is the people that the government serves to do right by. So if you're not talking to the people, then what are you doing? So the Populist Party says, if you want to win, if you want the support of the people, then you need to campaign, you need to listen to what the people want. Ask for change that makes sense to the masses. Remember, the Populist Party gains clout because it spoke to first the farmers, which was a huge part of the population, but then also gained backing not of the monopolies. They didn't gain backing because they were greasing the pockets of people with money. They gained support because they spoke to the needs of the people. So the Populist Party really leaves behind that legacy as well. Now, in class this week, we're going to hit the third part of this unit, which is going to be the beginnings of reform, which is the women's movement. So, again, we're kind of building up here to what the progressive movement turns into. We first start with the problems of the farmers who bring attention to the fact that you can cause change with a group of people. Then we have the Populist Party, who is the emergence of a third party, again finding the voice of the people to draw attention. And the third piece here is women who are going to do the same thing. They are going to gather to fight for reform. And that's kind of the trend that we'll see throughout this whole progressive era, is the people coming together demanding change. Now, don't forget, you have two assignments that are due. You have Journal 15. Make sure to do the Unit 7 readings. You have the Unit 7 documents to submit. And also make sure to start looking at the Unit 7 short paper. That's not due until January 22nd, but it is posted to be looked at.